Welcome to this journey into one of the most unsettling stories the graveyards of Perth have ever held in their cold, silent embrace. Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. Because the places we're about to walk through hide more than shadows and stone. They hide secrets that were never meant to resurface. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. Now, settle in. Make sure the lights are low, and prepare yourself. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story, it's a descent into a place where the living dare not tread. The narrow cobbled lanes of Perth were drenched in the grey drizzle that clung to the old stone buildings like a shroud. It was November of 1957, and most of the town had retreated indoors, leaving the streets eerily silent. Only the occasional footstep echoed off the brick walls, a lonely metronome marking the passage of time. Among these streets stood St. Bride's Church, a relic from the 18th century, its spire piercing the clouds as if begging for attention from the heavens. But beneath its solemn exterior, something rotten festered, hidden from the prying eyes of parishioners and city folk alike. The first to notice was Thomas Weaver, a junior archivist who had recently been assigned to catalogue the church's neglected manuscripts. He had a reputation for curiosity bordering on obsession. The town considered him peculiar, often muttering to himself, fingers ink-stained, eyes wide behind thick glasses. On that fateful morning, Thomas had descended into the church's basement to retrieve a set of old ledgers when he noticed a narrow passage concealed behind a stack of dusty pews. The air around it smelled of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic, like rusted blood. He hesitated, every instinct screaming to leave it be. But curiosity had always been a siren to him. Pulling the heavy wooden boards aside, he uncovered a trapdoor, its iron hinges corroded and brittle. The church's ledger, lying open on the floor, seemed to beckon him, almost warning him in its yellowed pages. Thomas took a deep breath, noting that his pulse had quickened, and tugged at the handle. It resisted, groaning like a wounded animal, before yielding to his grip. Beneath the trapdoor stretched a narrow staircase descending into darkness. He fumbled for his lantern and lit it, the small flame quivering as if afraid of what it would illuminate. Each step downward seemed to swallow sound, and the distant drips of water echoed louder than before. By the time Thomas reached the bottom, the air was colder, heavier, tainted with a musty stench that made his stomach churn. The floor was uneven, carved from rough stone, slick with moss and moisture. Ahead lay a chamber, larger than he anticipated. His lantern's glow revealed walls lined with alcoves, each containing skeletal remains that had long since been forgotten. Some were wrapped in tattered shrouds, others lay exposed, their bone surfaces marred by time. But it wasn't the sight of the bones that made Thomas freeze, it was the arrangement. The corpses had been deliberately positioned, some upright, others twisted unnaturally, their jaws frozen in silent screams. And then he saw it, a carving etched into the wall above the central alcove. The symbols were grotesque, curling like serpents and clawed hands, and a faint red stain marked their edges, impossibly fresh. Thomas took a step back, the lantern's light trembling with his hand. His rational mind struggled to dismiss the evidence before him, decades-old bones, strange carvings, and now the unmistakable metallic scent of blood, fresh and undeniable. A chill crawled up his spine, and instinctively, he wanted to flee. But before he could move, a low, guttural moan echoed through the chamber. It was not human, nor entirely animal. It vibrated through the stone, deep and resonant, raising the hairs on his arms. Suddenly, the trapdoor slammed shut above him with a deafening crash. The lantern flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest as the moans grew louder, multiplied, twisting into a cacophony of despair. He fumbled with the trapdoor, his hands slick with sweat, but it refused to budge. Panic clawed at him as he realized he was not alone. Shapes began to emerge from the alcoves, figures draped in shadows, eyes glinting faintly in the lantern light. They moved slowly, deliberately, their bones clicking softly, like the rhythmic ticking of a monstrous clock. Thomas stumbled backward, tripping over a loose stone. The lantern fell, rolling across the floor, extinguishing with a muted hiss. Darkness enveloped him. The moans became whispers, sibilant and urgent, threading themselves into his mind. Voices called his name. They spoke of deeds unspoken, of horrors buried deep beneath St. Bride's. One whisper lingered longer than the rest, "You shouldn't be here." In the suffocating blackness, Thomas's senses heightened. Every sound was amplified, every breath a thunderclap. The smell of decay filled his nostrils, and through it, he thought he could detect the faintest metallic tang, the scent of something freshly torn, freshly consumed. The whispers grew louder, almost commanding, beckoning him deeper into the crypt. Despite his terror, a force stronger than fear propelled him forward. He had to see what lay beyond, had to understand the grotesque ritual that had tainted this place for decades. Then, without warning, the ground beneath him shifted. The floor gave way, and Thomas fell into a deeper pit, landing with a harsh thud. Pain shot through his legs, but the pain was almost comforting compared to the abyss that surrounded him. He rolled onto his back, staring upwards, trying to make sense of the darkness. And then he saw it, a faint, flickering light at the far end of the pit, illuminating a figure hunched over a small altar. The figure turned slowly, revealing a skeletal face beneath a hood, eyes glowing red with unnatural fervor. Its hand raised, holding something that glinted in the dim light, a ceremonial dagger, darkened with age and something else that Thomas dared not name. The last coherent thought that crossed his mind before everything went black was simple and horrifying: he had awakened something that had been waiting, patiently, for decades. Thomas rolled onto his back, staring upwards at the flickering red glow that had illuminated the hooded figure before he lost consciousness. His limbs ached violently, but the pit he had fallen into had somehow transported him into a deeper, narrower corridor carved from the living rock itself. The air here was thicker, heavy with a metallic tang that clung to his throat and lungs. Every breath felt like inhaling iron and decay. A distant echo reached him, a soft, deliberate shuffling that made his skin crawl. Thomas forced himself to his feet, brushing the dust and grime from his coat. He gripped his lantern tighter, its flickering flame casting long, jittering shadows along the walls. The whispers from the pit had followed him, now a chorus of sibilant voices murmuring warnings and pleas in a language that twisted itself around his mind. He stumbled forward, the passage widening slightly into a chamber lined with alcoves like the first pit, though this one was more elaborate. Here, the remains were not just skeletal, they were grotesquely preserved, wrapped in ceremonial cloth, adorned with trinkets and jewelry that reflected candlelight from an unseen source. Each corpse had a position that suggested intent, as if posed for a ritual the living could not comprehend. And then he saw it, a figure crouched over one of the central alcoves, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. Hooded, skeletal hands working with care, it placed objects into a basin similar to the one he had seen before. The liquid within pulsed as if breathing. Thomas's pulse thundered in his ears. "You've seen too much," the voice hissed again, resonant both in the chamber and in his mind. "And yet, you walk freely, for now." Thomas instinctively crouched behind a stone pillar, barely daring to breathe. The figure paused, tilting its head as though aware of his presence. Then, without turning fully, it whispered something under its breath, words that made the shadows on the walls twist and writhe like living serpents. Fear propelled Thomas forward. He needed answers, and a way out. Crawling closer, careful not to make a sound, he observed the figure placing a carved, bone-like talisman into the basin. The liquid shimmered violently and, for a moment, the faces within it seemed to scream in unison. Then, the basin pulsed once, and the figure straightened, staring directly at him with hollow, glowing eyes. Thomas froze. The realization hit him: the ritual was not complete. Whatever the hooded figure was summoning or controlling, it could still be stopped, if he dared. A sudden tremor shook the floor. Dust fell from the vaulted ceiling above. The whispers rose to a crescendo, urgent, commanding, almost pleading. Figures began emerging from the alcoves, not shadows this time, but corporeal, skeletal yet moving with purpose, drawn to the basin at the chamber's center. Thomas's mind raced. There was no time to think, only to act. He noticed a jagged rock nearby, sharp enough to serve as a weapon. He picked it up, gripping it with trembling hands. Every instinct screamed to stay hidden, yet his curiosity, and fear, pushed him forward. One step, then another, the skeletal procession moving as if in a trance, circling the chamber in a slow, relentless rhythm. The hooded figure raised the dagger again. Thomas's hand tightened on the rock. He had to act before the ritual reached its apex. His heart hammered, each beat echoing in his skull like a war drum. The figure's eyes flared red, and for a moment, Thomas swore they looked human. Then they weren't. The air thickened, almost alive, pressing down on him from all sides. He hurled the rock with all his strength. It struck the basin's edge with a hollow, resonant clang. The liquid splashed, sending the writhing faces into chaotic motion. A scream, not human, not entirely, filled the chamber. The hooded figure let out a keening wail, lunging toward Thomas with unnatural speed. Thomas ran, the skeletal figures now moving to intercept him. He darted through the narrow corridors, guided by instinct and the faint glow of the basin's remaining light. The labyrinth seemed to shift behind him, walls closing and stretching as if the crypt itself were alive, intent on keeping him inside. Finally, he reached a set of stone stairs leading upward. He scrambled, nearly falling, the whispers now mocking, hissing, promising torment if he escaped. Reaching the top, Thomas pushed through another trapdoor, bursting into the church's basement once more. The contrast was jarring, the mundane scent of old wood and dust replacing the metallic stench of death. But the safety was fleeting. From beneath him came a low, rumbling growl, and the floor beneath the church vibrated as though something enormous stirred below. Thomas realized, with dread, that the crypt had not released him, he had only delayed what awaited. And somewhere down there, the hooded figure waited, patient and relentless, its ritual unfinished. Thomas staggered to his feet, heart pounding, mind racing. He knew he couldn't stay. The church, the town, even Perth itself, might be next if he didn't uncover the secret of the Crimson Bride before it was too late. The journey had only begun, and the screams beneath St. Bride's were far from finished. Thomas Weaver pressed himself against the cold stone wall of the church basement, trying to steady his racing heart. The familiar scent of old wood and dust gave a fleeting sense of normalcy, but the vibrations from below reminded him that the crypt was alive with something ancient, something hungry. His mind churned with questions: how deep did this labyrinth go, what had he truly disturbed, and what was the purpose of the Crimson Bride's ritual? He forced himself forward, navigating through the cluttered storage of old pews and discarded hymnals, searching for another way into the crypt. Finally, hidden behind a stack of brittle manuscripts, he discovered a narrow stairwell descending into darkness, a passage not previously noticed, as though the crypt itself revealed a new path only to him. The air that rose from it was colder, heavier, and carried the metallic tang of blood. As he descended, the walls of the corridor became increasingly ornate, carved with figures that twisted in agony, their faces frozen in silent screams. Thomas shuddered, the lantern casting trembling shadows. Every footstep echoed like a drumbeat, every creak of stone sending shivers down his spine. Whispers returned, fragmented and urgent. You see, witness," they urged him deeper, teasing the edges of sanity. At the end of the corridor lay a vast chamber, larger than any below St. Bride's he had yet encountered. The ceiling arched high, lost in darkness. Stone pillars lined the room, each etched with crimson symbols that pulsed faintly like the rhythm of a heartbeat. In the center, a massive stone altar dominated the chamber. Its surface was scarred with centuries-old ritual marks, and a large basin, similar to the one in the previous pit, shimmered with a sickly, undulating liquid. Around the altar, the hooded figures had multiplied. Not just one, but dozens, their skeletal hands moving in a deliberate, ceremonial pattern, chanting in a language that twisted itself in Thomas's mind. Each chant seemed to pull at him, a magnetic force that made him stagger forward despite the terror that rooted his feet to the stone floor. Suddenly, one of the figures noticed him. Its hollow, glowing eyes flared, and the chant paused abruptly. The room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint ripple of the basin's contents. Thomas's breath caught as the figure raised its bony hand, pointing directly at him. "You have come too far," it rasped, voice like grinding stone, yet somehow inside his head. "And now, you will see the witness." Before he could react, the liquid in the basin began to writhe violently. Faces emerged, twisted, screaming, human yet inhuman, their mouths moving as if calling his name. Thomas felt the sound resonate inside his skull, vibrating through every bone. A sudden, searing pain shot through his temples as images flashed before his eyes, visions of people trapped, rituals performed in secret, the city above oblivious to the horrors festering beneath their streets. Panic seized him. Thomas stumbled backward, nearly knocking over his lantern. One figure moved toward him, gliding across the floor with unnatural speed. Its dagger, blackened and etched with ancient symbols, glinted in the pale light. Thomas's mind raced. He had no weapon, no plan, and no idea how to stop what was unfolding. Then he noticed a narrow passage at the far end of the chamber. It was partially concealed by the massive altar, and though the path seemed treacherous, it offered the only potential escape. He bolted toward it, ignoring the whispers now screaming in his mind, "Stay, become, witness." The hooded figures reacted immediately, moving to intercept him. Thomas ducked behind a stone pillar, holding his breath as one of the figures passed within inches, its dagger scraping the floor with a bone-chilling screech. Heart pounding, he sprinted toward the passage. As he neared it, the chamber seemed to shift. Stone pillars twisted, shadows grew longer and more grotesque, and the floor trembled beneath him. The liquid in the basin surged, splashing over the edge, sending ripples of light across the room that illuminated countless eyes staring from the darkness. Thomas realized with horror, these figures were not just guardians of the crypt, they were part of it. They were bound to the ritual, bound to the basin, and to the witness it sought to manifest. He dove into the narrow passage, scraping his hands and knees along the jagged stone. Behind him, the echoes of the hooded figure's chants faded, replaced by a deep, resonant growl, like something enormous shifting in the shadows. Thomas didn't dare look back. The crypt was alive, aware of him, and it was hungry. The passage opened into a smaller chamber, the walls damp and lined with roots that dripped with water like tears. In the center stood a single figure, cloaked and hooded, but smaller than the others. It held a candle, its flame flickering without wind. Thomas's lantern illuminated the face beneath the hood, hollow eyes, a twisted grin frozen into the skeletal visage. "You are close," it whispered. "Closer than any living soul has been, but the witness is patient. It waits. And soon, you will understand." Thomas's legs trembled, but he pressed forward. The crypt had revealed its heart, and with it, the horrifying truth: whatever the Crimson Bride sought to awaken, it would not be content until it had claimed him, or something far worse. Where we leave Thomas now, the path forward is darker and more perilous than ever, and the witness below stirs in anticipation. Thomas stood in the damp chamber, the candlelight from the hooded figure flickering across the walls. The skeletal grin beneath the hood seemed to widen, though its lips had long since decayed. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, emanating from the very walls of the crypt, a resonance that seemed to thrum in Thomas's bones. He realized the whispering voices had multiplied, now an incessant roar circling his mind. The smaller figure stepped aside, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling down into darkness. "The witness waits," it said, voice like dry leaves rustling in a tomb. "Only those who descend will see, or become part of it." Thomas hesitated, but instinct propelled him forward. Every step downward thickened the air, a suffocating mix of earth, decay, and the metallic tang of blood. The walls were etched with more carvings, depicting human faces contorted in terror, being enveloped by shadows that reached out like living things. A cold dread coiled around his spine. At the bottom of the stairs, he entered a cavernous chamber. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, lost in shadows. In the center, a massive basin pulsed with the same sickly liquid from the previous chambers, but this one was alive with motion. Faces twisted and writhed in the fluid, screaming silently, their eyes imploring for release. Thomas's lantern trembled in his hand as he realized the basin was enormous, large enough to contain dozens of bodies submerged in the churning liquid. The hooded figures from before now surrounded the chamber, forming a circle. Their chants rose in pitch, echoing off the stone walls in a harmony that was anything but holy. Thomas felt the vibrations in his chest, as though the sound itself sought to penetrate his very soul. Suddenly, one of the faces in the basin turned toward him. It was human, or had once been, but its features were stretched and distorted, eyes pleading, mouth opening in a silent scream. Thomas felt a psychic pull, a magnetic tug at his mind, urging him closer. Every instinct screamed to flee, but something within the crypt's heart drew him forward. The central hooded figure, taller and more menacing than the rest, stepped into the chamber. Its bony hands rose, and the basin's liquid responded, forming tendrils that lashed outward like living shadows. Thomas stumbled backward, but the tendrils wrapped around his legs, cold and unyielding, pulling him toward the pulsating basin. "You seek answers," the figure intoned. "But answers come at a price." Thomas struggled, swinging his lantern wildly. The glass cracked, scattering shards across the floor. Sparks of fire flared, illuminating the chamber in brief, horrifying glimpses. In those flashes, he saw more than the ritual. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, pulsing with a dark life. Figures emerged from the shadows of the carvings, skeletal and half-formed, moving toward him. With a surge of adrenaline, Thomas kicked violently, breaking free from the tendrils momentarily. He ran toward the chamber's far edge, but the central figure raised the dagger, tracing a symbol in the air. The faces in the basin convulsed violently, and one exploded in a shower of black liquid that smelled of rot and iron. The scream that followed was deafening, yet internally, within Thomas's mind, it echoed for minutes. Realizing he had no other choice, Thomas lunged toward a narrow fissure in the wall, barely wide enough to squeeze through. The hooded figures lunged, but the fissure swallowed him. Darkness enveloped him completely, the sound of chanting fading behind. Yet, even in this darkness, he felt the presence of the witness. It was alive, patient, and aware of him. Through the narrow passage, he fell onto a cold stone ledge overlooking another chamber. From here, he could see the full scale of the crypt's horrors. Dozens of hooded figures moved in coordinated patterns around the central basin, their chants rising to a fevered pitch. And then he saw it, the witness itself. It was not a man, nor fully a creature, but a mass of writhing shadows, faces, and skeletal forms, suspended above the basin. It pulsed with malevolent energy, growing larger with each chant. The eyes of every figure in the chamber, every face in the basin, seemed to feed it, like fuel to a fire. Thomas's stomach turned. This was what the Crimson Bride had sought to awaken. He had thought the ritual was a test, a trap, but the truth was far worse. The witness was not just a creature, it was a force, a consciousness of agony and hunger that existed between life and death. And now, it knew he was here. The shadows below writhed, reaching toward him, and the chanting grew louder, merging into a single, deafening roar that shook the stones of the crypt. Thomas's mind screamed, but there was no escape, not yet. He had to survive, had to understand the witness, had to find a way to stop it, before it consumed everything above and below St. Bride's. Where we leave Thomas now, the witness has awakened, and the full horror of the crypt is revealed. The next steps he takes will decide whether he survives, or becomes part of the nightmare itself. Thomas crouched on the ledge above the vast chamber, staring at the fully awakened witness. Its form was a living nightmare, shadows woven with writhing faces and skeletal limbs, eyes blinking with a malevolent intelligence that made his blood run cold. Every pulse from the central basin seemed to feed it, every chant from the hooded figures giving it strength. His mind raced. There was no escaping the crypt, not without confronting it directly. Somewhere in the manuscripts he had studied, he remembered a passage describing the Crimson Bride's most dangerous secret: the witness could be disrupted by severing its connection to its vessels, the faces in the basin. If he destroyed them, he might weaken it enough to escape. He leaped down from the ledge, landing silently behind one of the stone pillars. The chanting continued, a hypnotic rhythm that made his legs tremble. The witness's gaze shifted suddenly, and for an instant, Thomas felt as though it could see into his very soul. Fear clawed at him, but he forced himself forward. The first basin of faces loomed ahead. He could see dozens of souls trapped within the viscous liquid, their eyes wide in terror, mouths open in silent screams. Thomas knew he couldn't destroy the witness outright, it was too powerful. But he could disrupt its focus. He grabbed a broken piece of stone from the chamber floor and hurled it into the basin. The liquid erupted violently, sending faces twisting and screaming upward. The witness shuddered, a deep, resonant howl vibrating through the chamber. Shadows recoiled, writhing as if in pain. The hooded figures shrieked, raising their arms to maintain the ritual. But Thomas did not hesitate. He moved from one basin to another, breaking the vessels one by one. Each disruption sent waves of psychic anguish echoing through his mind, yet he pressed on, driven by sheer survival instinct. Suddenly, a tendril of shadow lashed out from the witness, wrapping around his ankle. Pain shot through him as he was yanked toward the pulsating form. With a desperate effort, he severed the tendril with a jagged shard of stone. It recoiled with a screech, allowing him to scramble back. The witness writhed violently now, its form flickering like a shadow in stormlight. Faces emerged from the basins, some reaching toward him, some screaming, some crying. The chamber itself seemed alive, twisting and bending, walls expanding and contracting like lungs. Thomas realized the crypt was an extension of the witness, and every action he took sent ripples through the darkness. He paused, gathering his strength. The final basin was nearest the central figure, the hooded leader whose skeletal face had guided the ritual. Thomas knew he had to act fast. Timing his move with the peak of the witness's distraction, he lunged, breaking the basin apart. The liquid spilled across the floor, shrieking faces dissolving into shadowy tendrils that recoiled into the main form. For a moment, the witness froze, then shrieked in a sound that made Thomas's ears bleed. The hooded leader stumbled, dropping the dagger. The shadows recoiled, and the chanting faltered. The crypt itself seemed to quake as if mourning the disruption. Thomas didn't wait. He sprinted toward the staircase leading upward, ignoring the tendrils of shadow that lashed at him. One clawed his arm, but he pulled free, adrenaline propelling him upward. Behind him, the witness screamed, a deep, grinding wail, echoing through every stone of St. Bride's. He emerged back into the church basement, gasping for air, body trembling from exhaustion and fear. Above, the sun was beginning to rise, casting pale light through the stained glass. The crypt below was silent for the first time in decades, the shadows withdrawn, the witness suppressed, at least for now. Thomas sank to the floor, heart racing, mind reeling from the horror he had witnessed. He knew this was only a temporary reprieve, the witness had not been destroyed, only weakened. And the Crimson Bride's legacy was far from over. Somewhere in Perth, others might carry on the ritual. Somewhere, the witness waited to awaken again. Where we leave Thomas now, he has survived the heart of the crypt, but the nightmare beneath St. Bride's is far from ended, and the echoes of the screams will haunt him forever. Thomas sat in the quiet of the church basement, the first rays of morning slicing through the stained glass windows. His body ached, and his mind refused to calm. Though he had disrupted the witness and destroyed the basins, he knew the crypt's horrors were far from over. The shadows below St. Bride's were patient, and their reach could extend beyond stone and earth. He emerged into the streets of Perth, sunlight warm on his face yet unable to penetrate the sense of dread that clung to him. The town appeared normal, oblivious, but Thomas noticed subtle distortions, a man staring too long at a wall as though listening to something invisible, a child shivering under sunlight, whispering to shadows no one else could see. The crypt's influence lingered, threading through the town's veins. Determined to understand, Thomas returned home, poring over the manuscripts he had collected, cross-referencing sketches and notes. The Crimson Bride, he learned, had been a cult spanning centuries, each generation feeding the witness with rituals designed to keep it tethered yet ready for awakening. The rituals were precise, terrifying, and the crypt itself was the heart of their operations, a living entity that could reach, subtly, into the waking world. As night fell, Thomas could hear faint echoes beneath the city streets, the soft, distant whispers and murmurs of the hooded figures. Shadows shifted in corners of his room, fleeting but unmistakable. The witness was weakened, yes, but it was not gone. Somewhere below, it waited, its attention now aware of him personally. He resolved to act. The crypt could not be allowed to influence the town above, not again. With lantern in hand, Thomas descended back into St. Bride's, tracing familiar corridors, noticing now the faint pulse of the stone beneath his feet. The walls seemed quieter, but he could sense the latent energy of the witness, as though it were a dormant storm waiting to erupt. Deeper than he had ever gone, Thomas found remnants of rituals undone, the carvings half erased, the altars still intact, though cracked and worn. He set to work, breaking the remaining basins, scattering the remnants of the Crimson Bride's influence, chanting prayers and words of defiance to seal the crypt's powers. Shadows resisted, flaring violently, but Thomas pressed on, a singular focus burning through fear. Hours passed. Exhausted, he finally collapsed in a side chamber. The crypt was quieter now, the whispers fading to a low, watchful hum. Yet in the distance, a deeper resonance vibrated, something waiting, patient, knowing he had survived once, but not forever. Where we leave Thomas now, he has survived the witness's immediate wrath, disrupted its basins, and weakened the crypt's influence, but beneath St. Bride's, the shadows linger, and the witness waits. Its eyes are on him, on Perth, and the legacy of the Crimson Bride is far from buried. Thomas emerged from St. Bride's under the grey light of dawn, the streets of Perth appearing calm, almost peaceful. But the quiet was deceiving. He felt the lingering pulse of the crypt beneath the town, like a heartbeat that had imprinted itself upon the city. The witness, though disrupted, was far from gone. Its influence, subtle yet insidious, was creeping into the lives of the townspeople above, invisible to all but him. It began with whispers. Soft at first, slipping into the corners of ears as people went about their daily routines. A shopkeeper muttering to the shadows in his shop, a child staring into the empty street as if conversing with something unseen. Thomas noticed it immediately, these were not normal hallucinations, but tendrils of the crypt's will reaching outward. Fear spiked in his chest. He knew the witness had ways to extend its reach, even when its physical form was suppressed. He started to investigate, following the faint hum of malevolent energy. His footsteps led him to a narrow alley where the shadows seemed to bend unnaturally. A young woman crouched behind a barrel, whispering to herself, her eyes wide and dilated. As Thomas approached, she froze, her gaze locking onto him, but her lips moved silently. Then, without warning, she lunged toward the darkness behind her, screaming, only to find nothing there. Thomas caught her just in time, pulling her back. They're speaking to me," she stammered. "The shadows, they tell me things. Horrible things." Thomas swallowed hard. The crypt's influence was spreading faster than he had anticipated. It had survived the disruption of the basins. The witness was patient, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim its power. He guided the woman back to the church for safety, leaving her in the main hall where the morning light filtered through the stained glass, hoping the mundane world might shield her. But even as he moved through the streets, Thomas saw more signs, a man tearing at his own walls, shouting at unseen figures, a dog cowering in the street, for standing on end at shadows no one else noticed. Perth was being pulled into the crypt's nightmare, piece by piece. Thomas returned home, poring over every manuscript he had brought from the crypt. Notes, diagrams, and sketches covered his walls. One phrase repeated across multiple texts, "The witness does not rest. It feeds on the eyes of the living. When its basins are broken, it seeks vessels above." Realization struck him with horror. The townspeople were now its vessels. Every person touched by whispers, by shadows, by visions, was a potential host. The witness could manifest more fully if it could harness their fear, their agony. The basins had been its anchors, but it had learned to reach outward, to expand its domain beyond the crypt. That night, Thomas patrolled the streets. The fog rolled in early, swallowing lamplight and twisting the familiar alleys into something alien. Shadows danced where there should have been none, and whispers caressed the edges of his mind. He moved cautiously, trying to locate the epicenters of the witness's influence. A crowd had gathered in the town square, their eyes glazed, faces pale, murmuring in unison. Thomas approached carefully. The central figure, a man in a dark overcoat, raised his arms, repeating phrases in the cryptic language of the Crimson Bride. The air thickened, heavy with a malevolent presence. The shadows seemed to grow taller, stretching toward the crowd, and the witness's voice pulsed in Thomas's mind, "They are mine. They will serve. They will witness." Thomas's lantern flickered. He knew direct confrontation would be impossible here, the witness's power had spread, feeding on multiple hosts. He needed a strategy. Drawing from the manuscripts, he recalled mentions of purification rites, light as a weapon, chance to sever psychic tethering. It was risky, but the only chance to stop the spread. He began chanting, voice trembling but firm, invoking the words written centuries ago to counteract the Crimson Bride's influence. The crowd stiffened, some dropping to their knees, others screaming as the shadows lashed at them. The fog thickened, and tendrils of darkness snaked toward Thomas, seeking to silence him. The air vibrated with screams, both real and psychic. Thomas pressed on, his voice rising, the lantern casting piercing light. Faces in the crowd convulsed as shadows writhed over them, resisting, but the chant began to unravel the psychic links, severing the witness's influence one by one. Hours passed in this desperate battle. The fog gradually lifted, shadows retreating, whispers fading into nothing. When Thomas finally paused, the square was empty save for a few dazed townspeople, blinking in confusion at the sudden clarity. The witness had been weakened again, forced back into the crypt, but Thomas knew this was only temporary. Its reach had grown, its patience deeper than before. As dawn broke over Perth, Thomas looked down the streets, the normalcy of the town a fragile veneer. Beneath the cobblestones, in the silent darkness of St. Bride's crypt, the witness pulsed, dormant but aware. It had tasted the living world, felt its fear, and learned that escape was always possible. Where we leave Thomas now, the crypt's influence has spread, the town above shaken but surviving. The witness is patient, watching, and the stage is set for its eventual resurgence, closer, smarter, and hungrier than ever. Thomas stumbled out of St. Bride's crypt as the first hints of dawn stretched across Perth, painting the cobblestones with a fragile gold. The mist clung to the streets, curling around lampposts and market stalls, softening the edges of reality in a deceptive calm. Every instinct screamed that this serenity was temporary. The crypt below had been disturbed, its witness weakened, yet Thomas felt its presence in the subtle vibration of the ground beneath him, like the heartbeat of a living thing. The town appeared peaceful, almost too peaceful, but Thomas's eyes were drawn to subtle irregularities. Shadows clung to corners with unnatural stiffness, children paused mid-step, eyes darting toward invisible figures, and adults muttered words under their breath that seemed out of place, fragments of a language no one should know. The witness's influence was patient, it had retreated, but it was far from gone. Its hunger had expanded beyond the basins, threading into minds, waiting to awaken fully when the town above was ready to serve it. Thomas moved cautiously through the empty streets, his lantern casting long, wavering shadows that merged with those already lurking. He saw a young girl crouched by the fountain, fingers tracing the stone edge, eyes wide and unfocused. Her lips moved soundlessly as if whispering to something invisible. Thomas approached slowly, kneeling to meet her gaze. They talk to me," she whispered, voice trembling. "The shadows, they tell me terrible things." Thomas's chest tightened. He recognized the signs, the witness's psychic tendrils reaching for vessels in the living world. "You're safe," he said firmly, keeping his voice steady, though a chill ran down his spine. "They cannot hurt you while I am here." He guided her to the sanctuary of the church, hoping sunlight streaming through stained glass would shield her from lingering influence. Yet even as he moved, the town revealed more signs, a man clawing at his walls, shouting at invisible shapes, a woman standing frozen mid-step, whispering in a language Thomas knew from the crypt's manuscripts. Perth itself was under siege, subtly, by shadows that could no longer be contained beneath the church. Thomas spent the morning poring over the ancient manuscripts, diagrams sprawled across tables, lantern-light dancing on worn pages. The Crimson Bride's cult had been meticulous. They had documented basins, rituals, and psychic links to maintain the witness. Though he had disrupted the ritual, the texts revealed that the witness had methods to extend influence beyond stone and blood. Sunlight might mask the horror, but it could not erase it. By afternoon, Thomas patrolled the streets. The fog rolled in again, curling around corners, bending familiar alleys into shapes unrecognizable. Whispers brushed against ears where no sound existed, shadows moved without light, and faint cries echoed from empty buildings. He witnessed several townspeople overtaken by the witness's subtle influence, small gestures, murmurs, vacant stares, reminders that disruption was only temporary. A soft scream drew him toward the market square. A man writhed on the cobblestones, shouting at shadows only he could see. Thomas rushed forward, grasping his arms. It's okay. You're safe. The man recoiled violently, speaking phrases in the ancient language of the Crimson Bride, his eyes glazed with terror. The witness had reached outward, seeking vessels anew. Thomas's stomach churned as he realized how close the town had come to being drawn entirely into the crypt's nightmare. He led the man back to the church, securing doors and windows with protective symbols described in the manuscripts. Each mark etched in haste, each chant uttered, was a fragile shield against an invisible predator. Thomas knew that, for now, the town might remain safe, but he also knew the witness was watching, biding its time, learning, adapting. As the sun rose higher, golden light spilled over rooftops, casting warmth across Perth. Birds sang, the wind rustled through trees, and for the first time in hours, Thomas allowed himself to breathe. The town's normalcy was a fragile veil, masking the latent horrors lurking beneath. Standing at the church steps, lantern in hand, Thomas scanned the town. The streets slowly filled with cautious townspeople, each step a reminder of the witness's reach and the fragility of their apparent safety. Though shadows had retreated, their edges remained sharp, coiling in corners, waiting for the moment the witness would rise fully once again. Thomas felt exhaustion in his bones, but his mind raced with one certainty: the struggle was not over. The witness had survived, and Perth had been its playground. The crypt below remained alive, pulsing with dark energy, a heartbeat of malevolence that would not stop. He could protect the town for now, disrupt the influence, and keep the basins destroyed, but it would return. It always returned. He looked at the rising sun, feeling its warmth on his face, a fleeting comfort against the shadowed knowledge in his mind. The streets were quiet, but every whisper, every fleeting movement in the corners of his vision reminded him that the calm was temporary. The witness had tasted the world above, learned its vulnerabilities, and now it waited, patient, watching. Thomas exhaled slowly, feeling the fragile weight of dawn pressing around him. For now, the town was safe. For now, the shadows had retreated. But as he gazed across the square, the question gnawed at him more sharply than the exhaustion in his limbs. Was this truly the end, or merely the calm before the witness awakens once more? The sun rose higher, spreading golden light across Perth, but beneath St. Bride's, in the dark crypt, the heartbeat continued, steady, patient, eternal, and hungry.